Okay, folks, so here's the last lecture of the semester on Michel Foucault's Ethics of Resistance. The first version of this I thought was a little long, so I wanted to redo it and kind of adjust a couple of things that I discussed in there. So this will hopefully be a little bit shorter of a version of it. Michel Foucault is a neo-Nietzschean thinker. He takes his point of departure on a lot of things from Nietzsche, who we looked at in the last chapter. For example, one of Foucault's big projects is to develop a kind of genealogy of modern morality, particularly the modern individual, and how then the form that individuality takes. So that's what one of the main things we'll be looking at in this section. So let's get into it here. It is a little bit kind of maybe odd that we would have Foucault as the last thinker in a chapter that is primarily emphasizing alternative approaches to morality that emphasize comporting ourselves to the other, either with care ethics or Levinas's ethics, because Foucault's approach to ethics has much more in common with the key thinkers of the last chapter that were about self-creation and self-transformation. Nietzsche being one of those thinkers, Sartre being another. And so because Foucault's ethics emphasizes self-creation and self-transformation more than comporting myself to the other or encountering the other as the basis of obligation, like in Levinas, it's maybe a little bit different that your textbook author put Foucault last here, although the textbook author uses Foucault to talk about a different way of understanding the relationship between the self and others, and contrast that with somebody like Levinas. So I mentioned here that Foucault was a 20th century Nietzschean philosopher, and like Nietzsche, in some of the thinkers that we've looked at, especially in that last chapter, chapter 5, it might be, depending on what you've heard about Foucault, you might think, well, it's odd that Foucault would be studied in an ethics class at all, because like Nietzsche, isn't it the case that Foucault's ideas undermine the possibility of developing a coherent approach to ethics? Or maybe you even think, like some, that what Foucault promotes is really a form of immoralism, right? So something, that's kind of not an uncommon view of Foucault. And so I start off here, with Foucault's ethics question mark. It's kind of odd. So I mentioned two things here that to many scholars, Foucault and other commentators, not just scholars, but other commentators, Foucault's views, or what they take to be Foucault's views at least, seem to undermine the possibility of identifying and defending a normative standard to guide right conduct or good character, and to promote maybe even a form of immoralism and nihilism. So just as an example of that, here's a book called Liberal Fascism, where they talk about Foucault, and the author here says, this is kind of not an uncommon view of Foucault. He says, Foucault's hatred of Enlightenment reason was so profound that he celebrated the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the dictatorship of mullahs precisely because it was a pre-modern assault on Enlightenment principles. And again, this is in a book called Liberal Fascism, right? Not praise then for Foucault from that particular commentator. And Foucault never wrote a treatise on ethics like Mill's Utilitarianism or Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, or, we don't have like lecture notes they're like kind of similar to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or something like that out of Foucault. So that's one thing to note. And when he did turn explicitly to ethics at the end of his career, he defined ethics in a fairly idiosyncratic way. He talks about ethics in terms of not in terms like the definition of mainstream moral theory that I've given you of identifying and defending a normative standard to help us distinguish between permissible, impermissible, and prohibited actions, or even to seemingly identify virtues as opposed to vices, something like the golden mean. He never defends a principle like that. He talks about ethics in terms of the relationship of the self to the self, techniques of the self or practices of the self, the aesthetics of existence, and the care of the self. And so some of that language, some of that phrasing kind of maybe is reminiscent of, the Nietzschean idea that substitutes traditional moral norms substitutes an aesthetics of existence, shaping oneself, giving style to one's character, right? Aesthetic concerns over moral concerns, right? So one commentator, Richard Volan, calls Foucault's view an aesthetic decisionism that basically amounts to, well, I'm going to shape my life in ways that I find pleasing, but that basically involves using other people, right, to shape my own life. The primary concern is not what I owe others, which we often wrap up with morality, but how I make myself look, or how I shape my lifestyle, right, without regard to what I'm doing to others. So again, you might be worried here, or some commentators might think, well, what are you doing teaching Foucault in an ethics class in the first place? That's bizarre. So the problem that I have with commentators like that claim Foucault is kind of offering a liberal fascism is that they typically don't take into account what Foucault himself had to say about fascism. In fact, to be fair to them, it's not, it's easy to miss in Foucault's work. If you just pay attention to his major works and not what he says in some interviews or some other less commonly read things from Foucault that are outside of his major works, you miss it. But here's what Foucault did have to say about ethics. And I think it's significant for understanding what Foucault is really up to in those major works. So I pulled out a few quotations here. This comes out of a 1975 panel discussion where he says, I think that what has happened since 1960 is characterized by the appearance of new forms of fascism, new forms of fascist consciousness, and new forms of the fight that should be fight against fascism. And the role of the intellectual since the 60s has been precisely to situate, in terms of his or her own experiences, competences, personal choices, and desire, to situate him or herself in such a way as both to make apparent forms of fascism which are unfortunately not recognized or too easily tolerated, to describe them, to try to render them intolerable, and to define the specific form of struggle that may be undertaken against fascism. That's what I think Foucault himself is up to. He's not just talking about other intellectuals here. He's talking about his own project. Following up on that point, from a essay that he wrote later on in his career, he says, my point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad. And then he says later in that same thing, he says, to sum up, the main objective of these struggles is not to attack such and such a form, an institution of power, a group or elite or class, but rather a technique or a form of power. This form of power applies itself to immediate everyday life, which categorizes the individual, marks him by his own individuality, attaches to him to his own identity, imposes a law of truth on him, which he must recognize and which others have to recognize in him. It's a form of power which makes individuals subjects. There are two meanings to the word subject: subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by a conscience or self-knowledge. Both meanings suggest a form of power which subjugates and makes subject to. So one thing to note here, the reason why Foucault is kind of well known as a scholar is precisely for kind of focusing and introducing power into contemporary scholarship, and making it a big theme in his work, right? And so that's what he's talking about in part here. And then he goes on in that same piece, Subject and Power. Maybe the target nowadays is not to discover who we are, but to refuse who we are. We have to imagine and to build up what we could be to get rid of this kind of political double bind, which is simultaneously individualizing and totalization of modern power structures. The conclusion would be that the political, ethical, social, philosophical problem of our days is not to try to liberate the individual from the state and from the state's institutions, but to liberate us both from the state and from a type of individualization that is linked to the state. So we see right away that resistance to power is not going to be just reaffirming the individual and the individual rights against the state or against an institution. He says we have to promote new forms of subjectivity through the refusal of this kind of individuality, which has been imposed on us for several centuries. That's Foucault's project in terms of ethics. Right? And so even kind of a little bit, maybe we might think more hyperbolically, but a little bit more directly, what Foucault says in his preface to Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, which was another book written by some contemporaries, some contemporary French thinkers that were contemporaries of Foucault. He says in the preface of that book, which he wrote for them, the strategic adversary is fascism, the fascism in us all. And again, I'm taking Foucault here not to be talking just about this book, Anti-Oedipus, but about his own project, right? The fascism in us all. It, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. So usually when we think of fascism, what we're thinking of is someone dominating us, right? A form of government that's dominating us. But Foucault seems to be thinking here of fascism is a way of life, right? Not just a form of government. And even more importantly, that it's something going on with us, right? So what Foucault's less hyperbolically, what Foucault seems to be worried about with this idea that fascism in our heads is a form of self-subjugation. That's the new form of fascism that he's trying to describe here, and that he's trying to identify the resources for combating. And so I've used pop culture all semester, right? As an example, a pop culture example of what I think Foucault's talking about here. We can think about a few things that go on in this this series. It's based on a book, or maybe a series of books called Man in the High Castle. It's a series on Amazon that they produced, and the show is about it's an alternative history where the Nazis won the war and invaded the U.S. and conquered and control about half of the U.S., right? And then the Japanese won on their side, and they've pushed in from the West Coast, and then there's a neutral zone in the middle of the U.S. But there's a U.S. Nazi party, and it's all, again, an alternative history. And one of the main characters that we follow through this series is John Smith, who used to be in the American army that was fighting the Nazis, but gets defeated. And let me take a drink here. And under difficult circumstances, he's worried about starving and worried about what's going to happen to his family, is offered a chance to join the Nazis and does so, becomes a member of the Reich, not just a citizen in that society, but a member of the Nazi regime, and rises through the ranks very high up in the U.S. Nazi party. So not only does he go along with the Nazis or not resist passively the Nazi occupation, he becomes an enforcer of Nazi policy, right? He's a member of the Nazi party. And he has a son, Thomas, here. And Thomas is raised under Nazi rule and is a devoted Nazi himself, promotes Nazism in his school, is concerned with those who resist that way of life and that form of government. And what happens is that, so in other words, he's been indoctrinated by Nazism, right? Not just the political ideology of Nazism, but the behaviors of Nazism, right? Or fascism, right? And so he's a young man that's devoted to that form of government and that way of life. But in the series, he learns that, and so he's committed to Nazi eugenics, right? He learns that he has a genetic disorder and a disease, right, that makes him unfit as a member of the Aryan race, right? He's a weak part of the collective, right? And so what he does, and this is kind of the staggering moment at the end of one of the episodes, one of the seasons, is that he self-reports for extermination. Instead of someone else turning him in, or coming to get him and collecting him, he turns himself in for extermination, right? So that's kind of what I take to be an uncontroversial example of self-subjugation of what Foucault is talking about here. What Foucault is obviously worried about are not extreme examples, but examples that are not of devoted ideological Nazis performing the same sorts of behaviors, right? That's what he means by the fascism in our heads. So that's kind of what I take to be a straightforward example of what Foucault is worried about. But Foucault is also worried about, the fascism in our own behaviors, the people that don't take themselves to be Nazis and are not committed to Nazi propaganda, but still have behaviors that are self-subjugating, because it's those behaviors that can then be crystallized into a form of government. Right? And so Foucault's basic project then is to develop a genealogy of the modern individual, and he's going to give that form of individuality a name, a docile body. And secondly, to develop an account of resistance against that form of self-subjugation, what he calls reflective indocility. Most of Foucault's works, in fact, all of his major works, are devoted to the first part of that project, just developing the genealogy. In order to find out what Foucault thinks that the ethics would look like, he never produces a treatise on ethics or anything like that. He never writes a book called Ethics Against Fascism in Our Heads or anything like that, although Deleuze did an Anti-Oedipus, right? Foucault's friend and fellow philosopher there. And so Foucault thinks that power produces individuals, and so mostly what Foucault's works are all about are how power operates in modern society. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then try to piece together what an ethics of resistance might look at, like at least an outline to that form of modern individuality. So first, Foucault's idea of power. And I'm going to skip over all of the stuff that's important, but that you're probably not interested in for our purposes, an introduction to ethics, about how Foucault's view of power changes over his career or anything like that. I'm just going to, put out what it looks like his final view is, again, from some passages that he wrote later on in his career. So he says, as far as this power is concerned, it's first necessary to distinguish that what is exerted over things and gives the ability to modify, use, consume, or destroy them, a power which stems from aptitudes directly inherent in the body or relayed by external instruments. Let's say there's a question of a capacity. So that's the first one thing that Foucault means by power, is it's a capacity to do something. On the other hand, what characterizes power, the power we are analyzing, is that it brings forth into play relations between individuals or between groups. So capacity, power is a capacity to do something, to a faculty of being able to perform some task, right? An ability. And then on the other hand, it's a social relationship, right? So he says, for let us not deceive ourselves. If we speak of the structures or the mechanisms of power, it is only insofar as we suppose that certain persons exercise power over others. The term power designates relationships between partners. And by that, I am not thinking of a zero-sum game, but simply, and for the moment staying in the most general terms, an ensemble of actions which induce others and follow from one another. So in traditional moral and political philosophy, power is thought about in terms of institutions and as a property of either individuals or institutions or governments, right? Foucault's trying to get away from that narrow way of thinking about power. It's true that there are institutions and governments, but what they do is they kind of crystallize and freeze power relationships, right? Power, fundamentally for Foucault, is as he says, it's not a zero-sum game. It's a matter of the conduct of conduct, right? That's what he thinks power is. And then institutions, of course, can render those immobile. And in fact, that's kind of what an institution is it immobilizes or freezes power relationships so that you have, workers, managers, administration, and so forth. So here's my silly everyday example of what Foucault means by power. He uses this phrase, the conduct of conduct, right? So sometimes I walk across campus from a classroom back to my office, and the person that I'm walking with doesn't know where my office is, but we're going back to my office, and we're having a conversation, talking along the way, and without directing them explicitly saying we're going this way or going that way, The way in which my body comports itself guides their own conduct or shapes their own conduct so that we're walking together without really ever being explicit about where we're going. I know where we're going, they don't. And, you know, the way my body moves tells them, oh, I need to turn this way or that way, right? That's the conduct of conduct. So our behavior, our conduct is shaped by structures and so there are possibilities, right? Within a field of possibilities, right? That's what Foucault is primarily talking about here. So he says, perhaps the equivocal nature of the term conduct is one of the best aids for coming to terms with the specificity of power relations. For to conduct is at the same time to lead others according to the mechanisms of coercion, which are to varying degrees strict, and a way of behaving within a more or less open field of possibilities. The exercise of power consists in the guiding the possibility of conduct and putting in order the possible outcome. Basically, power is less a confrontation between two adversaries or the linking of one to the other than a question of government. So it's certainly the case that power relationships can become a form of domination, right? It's not like all power relationships are a matter of domination for Foucault, but they could become that way, right? There are more and less strict forms of social relationships, in other words, right? And in an institution that's rigidified and everybody has their particular role within a hierarchy and so forth, right? But in other aspects of our life, you know, do what you want, right? So it's a way of thinking about power that it doesn't take as the model of power domination. And that's usually how we think of power, right? And so earlier in this semester, this distinction between freedom from external constraints versus positive freedom was discussed. Foucault's way of thinking about both power and freedom kind of doesn't fit that model, right? He's thinking of a social relationship that can become a form of domination. That's kind of the limit or the end point of power that is fluid, right? Understood as a fluid conduct of conduct, right? You can have your parents are more and less strict with you, right? And when they're more strict, it becomes more like domination. And when they're less strict or not governing you at all, you have more possibilities before you, right? The field of possibilities is more open. So he says, another thing that he talks about in terms of governmentality or power relations as governmentality, so that governing or the conduct of conduct, right, is structuring the field in which individuals behave in an institution, right, which can be, again, be done in more or less strict ways. He also says that the contact between technologies of domination, right, the domination of others and those of the self, I call governmentality. Perhaps I've insisted too much on the technology of domination and power. I am more interested in the interaction between oneself and others in the technologies of individual domination. The history of how the individual acts upon himself is a technique of the self, right? And so what Foucault's interested in his genealogy of the modern subject is accounting for a process of subject formation or subjectivization or forming individuals, right? So the way I'm talking is that modern individuality, according to Foucault, has a particular form that it is taken and that is formed and structured by power relationships, right? And that involves both the interplay of other people directing me, right? As well as how I direct myself. The individual is formed through a combination of those two things, right? So when I, for example, internalize the norms that are associated with a technique of power and view that as myself or my identity, then I'm internalizing a certain identity and the norms that go along with it, and I've adopted a certain form of individuality. All right. So I'll come back to that here in a minute. So the way in which Foucault thinks power, the conduct of conduct, operates in modern societies is what he calls biopower, right? So again, he's not saying that biopower is inherently authoritarian. At least I don't think he's saying that. But that's the aim or the way power operates today, right? So I'll come to that. But before I turn to that, the technique of the self that Foucault is interested in primarily is like an idea of confession, right? That we tell people who we are. Sometimes we think of confession as I've got to discover within myself my true identity, right? And then I relay that to others, and then on the basis of that truth claim about who I am, I govern myself in accordance with that, and I expect others to relate to me in accordance with that identity, right? And so confession is a matter of producing or forming the self. It's a way in which I can act upon myself and govern myself, right? And so he says the confession has spread its effects far and wide. This is from the book, The History of Sexuality, right? One of the ways in which I understand myself as an identity, right? As having an identity is through what kind of sexual being I am. And he says, the confession has spread its effects far and wide. It plays a part in the justice, medicine, education, family relationships, and love relationships, in the most ordinary affairs of everyday life, and is in the most solemn of rights. One confesses one's crimes, one's sins, one's thoughts and desires, illness and troubles. One goes about telling with the greatest precision whatever is most difficult to tell. One confesses in public and in private, to one's parents, to one's educators, one's doctor, to one's loves. One admits to oneself in pleasure and in pain. One confesses or is forced to confess. Man, Western man, has become a confessing animal. One of the things Foucault is up to in this History of Sexuality book, and most of his major works have this kind of element to them. We're told a usual history about the way things go, but Foucault is telling a subversive history of how things have actually occurred. And so one of the things that people think about the development of sexuality in modern society is that it's been repressed. And Foucault's saying, hold on a minute. What we really do, we don't repress sexuality. We talk about it all the time. We need to confess who we are, right, all the time. And that's a way of producing our identities, right? And so we can think of confession in a slightly different way because we have social media, right? And I mean, the tagline of YouTube is broadcast yourself, right? And so I'm willing to bet that, like me, you form an identity of yourself in different ways on some of these different platforms, but we're inserting ourselves into these platforms, right? And producing ourselves. LinkedIn is your professional self, right? Maybe Snapchat is not, right? You relate to your family members through, Facebook. I don't even know if y'all still really use Facebook or not, right? So confession plays a role in social media. We are tweeting about ourselves, we're giving status updates about ourselves, and that implies a way in which we relate not only to ourselves and the way we're forming ourselves as individuals, but how we're relating to others as well. And so now to that notion of biopower, right? Foucault thinks, again, modern Western societies are, modern societies in general, really, I think, that the way power operates today is to manage life, right? Not only the life of the population, but the life of the individual. In fact, both of those go together. It's not one versus the other. So he says, in concrete terms, starting in the 17th century, this power over life evolved in two basic forms. These forms were not antithetical. However, they constituted rather two poles of development linked together by a whole intermediary cluster of relations. One of these poles, the first to be formed, it seems, centered on the body as a machine. It's disciplining. The optimization of its capabilities, the extortion of its forces, the parallel increase of its usefulness and its docility, its integration into systems of efficient and economic controls. All of this was measured by the procedures of power characterized as disciplines. So one pole of biopower is disciplinary power. Right? That's the one we're going to focus on because it's the one that has to do with how we form ourselves as individuals, or how the modern individual was formed, rather. Right? And anatomopolitics of the human body. The second form, somewhat later, focused on the species body, the body imbued with the mechanics of life and serving as the basis for biological processes, propagation, birth, mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity, with all of the conditions that can cause these to vary. Their supervision was effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the population. So we have the disciplines that focus on the individual body, and then Another element of biopower is to focus on the population as a whole, but these are coextensive with one another. The disciplines of the body and the regulations of the population constituted the two poles around which the organization of power over life was deployed. The setting up in the course of the classical age, the modern era, of the great bipolar technology, atomic and biological, individualizing and specifying, directed towards the performance of the body with attention to the processes of life, characterized a power whose highest function was perhaps no longer to kill, but to invest life through and through. So one way of thinking about power in modern society is in terms of a sovereign who says you get to live or you get to die. But in what Foucault's saying is that that's not really how power works today. There are examples of sovereignty in institutions and stuff like that, but it's not a matter of one organization. It's a whole cluster of organizations that interrelate to one another and that take as their main target the administration of life. It's not like a sovereign is sitting back and saying, you get to live, you get to die. Right? So modern society is comprised of all these different institutions, the government, the World Health Organization, universities, all these different things, right? Nonprofits that are concerned with public health, right? So he says excuse me, he says the old power of death that symbolized sovereign power was now carefully supplanted by the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life. I'm managing my cat's life right now by moving him out of the window. He's pawing at it. He says, during the classical age, there was a rapid development of various disciplines, universities, secondary schools, barracks, workshops. There was also the emergence in the field of political practices and economic observation, the problems of birth rate, longevity, public health, housing, and migration. Hence, there was an explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations, marking the beginning of an era of biopower. So biopower is the administration of life, and it has, again, two poles: disciplinary power that focuses on individuals, and biopolitics that focuses on the life of the population. All right, so we can think of a contemporary, it's very easy right now to think of a contemporary version of biopower, or rather version of an example of biopower, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. The reason why I'm talking to you here rather than in a classroom is because of a pandemic. And what are we all at home trying to do? We are trying to flatten the curve. What are we talking about when we talk about flattening the curve, right? We talk about controlling the spread of this disease so that we don't overrun our healthcare system, right? So flattening the curve is about spreading out the rate of infection so that we all don't go to the hospital at once and all need ventilators all at once, which have a limited supply. We're trying to spread that out, right? So that involves both my individual behavior. I could either stay home and self-isolate, minimize my contact with others that might be asymptomatic carriers, or I could go out and not care and run around and do all the stuff that I really want to do, but I'm not, because I don't want to get myself sick and I don't want others to get sick either. So what are all of our institutions kind of worried about right now? They're worried about, getting people to wash their hands for 20 seconds, right? To self-isolate as much as possible, to only engage in essential activities so that we don't overrun the healthcare system, right? That's an example of biopower. Again, I don't think Foucault's saying that that's inherently authoritarian, although we could see how it very well could become that way, right? So all right, we got biopower then, and now let's focus on disciplinary power. So that's what's really focused on individuals. So Foucault actually wrote this book, Discipline and Punish, before History of Sexuality. I'm reversing the order of these for the purposes of my presentation. Right? So what Foucault does is he talks about, chronologically, he talks about disciplinary power, then he recasts disciplinary power in the context of biopower. I'm just presenting biopower first. So in this book, Discipline and Punish, the birth of the prison, what are prisons worried about in the modern era? Reforming individuals so that they become productive members of society, right? So he says the human body was entering something like disciplines that he just mentioned. Now we're discipline and punish, right? So he says the human body was entering a machinery of power that explores it, breaks it down, and rearranges it. A political anatomy, which was also a mechanics of power, was being born. It defined how one may have a hold over other bodies, not only so that they may do what one wishes, but here's the key thing, but so that they may operate as one wishes. With the techniques, the speed and efficiency that one determines, thus discipline produces subjected and practiced bodies. Docile bodies. Discipline increases force of the body in terms of economic utility and diminishes these same forces in political terms of obedience. So a docile body is economically useful and politically obedient, right? Again, what are prisons supposed to do? They're reforming the individuals, right? From criminal or delinquent to productive member of society, right? That means getting them to adopt a certain identity of themselves and to fit that into the society at large. And that's what he thinks disciplinary power does. That happens in prisons, but it also happens in other places as well in less stark or strict ways. So here's an example of the prison. Foucault's worried about the Panopticon, which is how the architecture of prisons. And interestingly enough, the Panopticon was the idea of Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian moral philosopher. Of course, Bentham and the utilitarians had many classical liberal and even progressive ideas about individuals, but Foucault's point is that this disciplinary power is not operative just in authoritarian regimes, it's also operative in liberal societies, right? So remember, he's talking about the fascisms that we don't recognize, right? He thinks that there's a worry about that these sorts of behaviors, this form of individuality, right, operates not only in authoritarian regimes, right, but in liberal democracies, liberal societies as well. That's his point about disciplinary power and biopowers, that they function in these other kinds of societies as well. And of course, we know from history that you can go from one to the other pretty quick. Authoritarian regimes only survive if they have some kind of popular support, right? So here's a modern prison and the idea of the Panopticon. We see that in this episode here, where you have a cross section of the prison, and this one over here on the right is an example of the cell, an individual in shackles kneeling down here in his individual self facing the Panopticon, right? The Panopticon is a central tower in the prison through which we observe individuals. So surveillance is a form of power. It's a technique of domination, according to Foucault, right? And so how does this prison operate in terms of its actual structure and the way it shapes behavior? Well, it does so through surveillance. There's a guard in the tower, and if the guard sees you misbehave, then he enforces a certain behavior on you. But the idea of the Panopticon is that that form of power becomes internalized such that the good, right, the good inmate comes to police themselves in accordance with the norms that are imposed upon them by that structure. They come to internalize that form of individuality. So again, here's just a modern version of that prison. There's the Panopticon in the center. And then he says, discipline makes individuals, right? I'm going to move this up a little bit. He says, discipline makes individuals. It is the specific technique of power that regards individuals both as objects and as instruments of its exercise. Right? So normally we think of power just dominating me, coming from the outside. But Foucault's point is that I've formed my individuality by internalizing. I formed my own identity in part by internalizing aspects of a technique of domination. Remember, he says that governmentality power operates through the interplay of techniques of the self, how I shape my own existence, and the interplay of those practices of the self with techniques of domination. So he says the success of disciplinary power derives no doubt from its use of simple instruments, hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and their combination in a procedure that is the examination. And he means literally an examination both of you or what you're doing. The examination combines the technique of observing hierarchy, so power relationship there, and those of normalizing judgment. You did poorly or you did badly. It's the normalizing gaze, a surveillance that makes possible to qualify, to classify, and to punish. It establishes over individuals a visibility through which one differentiates them and judges them. At the heart, not the heat, but the heart of these procedures of discipline, it manifests the subjection of those who are perceived as objects and the objectification of those who are subjected. So remember his idea of the subject. I'm subject to other people's control, but I also have a form of individuality. Right? I'm tied to a power structure in virtue of my individuality. Just think how common it is for us to talk about who we are in terms of our jobs. And of course, our jobs often involve hierarchical relationships. Who are you, Chris? I'm an instructor at LSU. Inserts me into the hierarchy. Right? So the major effect then of that panopticon, right, Foucault says, is to induce in the inmate a state of consciousness and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. So to arrange things that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, I become self-policing, even if it's discontinuous in its action, that the perfection of power should render its actual exercise in terms of force unnecessary, that this architectural apparatus should be a machine for creating and sustaining a power relationship independent of the person who exercises it, the warden or the guard. It is, in short, that the inmate should be caught up in a power situation in which they are themselves the bearer, right? So again, Thomas here in High Castle has internalized some norms of behavior, what counts as his identity in a hierarchical structure, and since he is life that is unworth the Aryan race, he turns himself in. He subjugates himself for extermination, a radical form of self-subjugation there. And Foucault's point is that that panoptic structure doesn't stay inside the prison. Remember, he just talked about biopower. Disciplinary power is operative in all sorts of institutions. On the whole, therefore, we can speak of the formation of a disciplinary society and its movement that stretches from the enclosed disciplines, a sort of social quarantine, to an indefinitely generalizable mechanism of panopticism. So although it depends on the size of the organization, and I think some of these might not be as prevalent as they used to, dividing your staff up into cubicles where they, and sometimes the manager's cubicle at the end has a higher barrier than everybody else's so that he can kind of look over and see everybody else's, but they can't see into what the manager's doing, right? It's dividing people up in space, right? That's what Foucault's worried about. And of course, you can have your internet activity monitored, right? So just to give you, again, a kind of interesting example, I think, of panopticism, Zoom, which I'm using right now to record this lecture, although not live, for you anyway, has an attendee attention tracking feature that, as I understand it, was originally developed for the use of teachers to know when students who are using remote education and having Zoom meetings, to know when that individual is paying attention to the teacher over Zoom or not. And of course, that could be used by a boss to know when an employee is paying attention to their computer or whether they're off doing something else, looking down at their phone, right? Likewise, Moodle gives me a lot of information about students. I have over here on the right an example using me. And Moodle will generate a report to show what I accessed and when on Moodle, and it will allow me to see that with regard to each of you, right? So if a student were to come to me and say, Mr. Blakely, I've been trying really hard and studying really hard for this class, but I'm just not able to do well in it. Can I have an opportunity to earn more points by doing some additional work? I've done poorly on all these really difficult assignments you've given us, but I just haven't been able to, show you how much I know. Can I have another shot at something, or can I redo an exam? I've just been studying really hard. I've watched all the lectures that you've put up on Moodle. I've gone through all the reading questions. I've looked at all the additional resources that you've put on Moodle for me. I can pull up a report on Moodle that will show me whether or not that student accessed that material at all, when they accessed it, and match that up from where it was assigned, so I could basically see, did this student really access those materials on the schedule that I wanted them to do so that they gave themselves time to study thoroughly and do all of that work to build up to an exam? Or did they download all that stuff the night before the exam? And then on the basis of that knowledge, I know what kind of student that is, and I can make an evaluation of whether I think that student is trying really hard or if they're blowing off class. And then of course, determine whether or not I'm going to give them an extra opportunity or not, right? Panopticism, that's surveillance, and using surveillance and knowledge about what I gained through that surveillance is a way of exercising power. All right, so that's how a docile body is formed. So Foucault's genealogy of the modern individual is a genealogy of how we became docile bodies. What's his plan for resisting docility, right? Well, in this, he doesn't get very far down this road before he dies in 1984. But there are some elements that he talks about of an ethics of resistance. And if docility, the fascism in our heads, is a matter of internalizing norms of behavior that put us on the bottom end of a hierarchy, right? So that I conceive of my very identity in terms of an internalized power relationship in which I'm either on top or on bottom or somewhere in the middle, right? What we need is an ethics of resistance to docility, right? So Foucault talks about this in terms of the Enlightenment and an Enlightenment attitude, the age of reason. Foucault's often presented as an anti-Enlightenment thinker or a postmodern philosopher that rejects everything about the Enlightenment, but at the end of his life, he says, well, this is the part of the Enlightenment that I'm in favor of, right? The reason why he's talked about as an anti-Enlightenment thinker is because what he does with all these modern institutions that his books are about is show that they really gave rise to a new form of domination, right? So that makes it look like he's rejecting the idea that the Enlightenment and the modern era is one of social, moral, and political progress in terms of, greater individual freedom, and undercutting that and saying, yeah, you're an individual, but you're a subjugated individual. So many people have read that as saying, well, he's against the Enlightenment, right? But what Foucault does is he says, look, the philosophical ethos may be characterized as a limit attitude. We're not talking about a gesture of rejection. We have to move beyond the outside-inside alternative. We have to be at the frontiers. Criticism indeed consists of analyzing and reflecting upon limits. But if the Kantian question, Immanuel Kant, right? If the Kantian question was that of knowing what limits knowledge has to renounce transgressing, it seemed to me that the critical question today can be turned back into a positive one. In what is given to us as universal, necessary, and obligatory, what place is occupied by whatever is singular, contingent, and the product of arbitrary constraints? The exercises of power presuppose some knowledge claim, right? So if what we're claiming counts as knowledge is not warranted, if it is of dubious epistemic merits, then that means the exercise of power is going to be problematic, right? So the point in brief is to transform the critique conducted in the form of necessary limitation into a practical critique that takes the form of a possible transgression. Ethics of resistance, ethics of going beyond or overcoming what is structured, right? On the basis of some alleged claim, at least some alleged claim of universality and necessity. So critique then, right, he characterizes in terms of a virtue. Now we're back to a fairly common mainstream idea in morality. It's just that Foucault's understanding critique in a kind of a radical way, or virtue in a radical way. So he says there's something in critique or enlightenment, or the critical ethos of the Enlightenment, that's akin to virtue. And in a certain way I wanted to speak to you about is this critical attitude as a virtue in general. And then he goes on in that same essay, which is called What is Critique? I will say that critique is the movement by which the subject gives himself the right to question truth on its effects of power and to question power on its discourse of truth. Well, then critique will be an art of voluntary insubordination, that of reflective indocility. And I've added the emphasis there. Critique would essentially ensure that the desubjugation of the subject in the context of what we could call, in a word, the politics of truth. Again, power is exercised over us on the basis of some claim to knowledge about what our true identity is, right? Foucault's kind of rejecting the idea, or is rejecting the idea, that we have a true self-identity that can be pinned down. You're either this or that. So he says, in a sense, I'm a moralist insofar as I believe that one of the meanings of human existence, the source of human freedom, is to never accept anything as definitive, untouchable, obvious, or immobile. No aspect of reality should be allowed to become definitive and inhuman law for us. We have to rise up against all forms of power, not just power in the narrow sense of the word, referring to the power of a government or the one of a social group over another. These are only a few particular instances of power. Power is anything that tends to render immobile and untouchable those things that are offered to us as real, as true, as good. So oftentimes people say it has to be this way, right? And much of Foucault's works are about this. How is it that society and these institutions has determined what is abnormal versus normal, right? And if you're abnormal, we get to exercise power over you in some way. Well, Foucault is challenging the idea that that distinction is grounded in truth. That's what he seems to be challenging. He talks about the human sciences in this way. So it looks like Foucault is challenging the scientific status of the human sciences in that regard. So he says, this doesn't mean that we must live in indefinite discontinuity, right? You might get the idea, well, what Foucault's saying is that we just have to, kind of be chaotic anarchists or something like that. He says, this doesn't mean that one must live in indefinite discontinuity. But what I mean is that one must consider all the points of fixity, of immobilization as elements in a tactics and a strategy, as part of an effort to bring things back to their original mobility, their openness to change. I was telling you earlier about the three elements in my morals. They are the refusal to accept self-evidence, the things that are proposed to us, the need to analyze and to know, since we can accomplish nothing without reflection and understanding. That's a principle of curiosity. And three, the principle of innovation, to seek out in our reflection those things that have never been thought or imagined. Thus, refusal, curiosity, innovation. Remember, I started with this claim that from Foucault that our task is not to discover the truth about who we are, but to refuse what we are told we are, and to create new forms of subjectivity, new forms of individuality that are resistant to docility, or that overcome docility. Right? So this is critique as an ethics of self-relation, or a technique of the self. Foucault's worried about the ways in which our techniques of the self have inserted us into these institutions that we then internalize and become subjugated through. But what he's done is trying to elaborate a version of a technique of the self as critique that is resistance to that, right? So that would involve the refusal of essentialist or static self-identities, including and especially those we impose on ourselves. A curiosity, in other words, adopting a creative attitude towards the self as a work of art rather than as something to be formed. So for Sartre, existence precedes essence, and the idea of authenticity is to create a static identity for oneself, to be true to who oneself is and one's freedom. Foucault is kind of rejecting that approach, right, and saying that that what we ought to do is not try to define ourselves, right, in a particular single way, as if it is the one single truth about ourselves, right, but rather to engage in practices of self-transformation continually, it looks like. That's why the goal of this practice, right, is innovation. The innovation or the creation of new and shared forms of subjectivity that lie outside of and potentially resist the identity, norms of conduct, and the hierarchical and forms of hierarchy that are normalizing and exclusionary that we associate with domination. So then ethics, the ethics of resistance, is going to be an ethics of refusing, totalizing, hierarchical, and normalized identities and the creation of new forms of subjectivity without simply inverting or reestablishing new totalizing, hierarchical, and normalized identities, right? So this is a bit of a problem to worry about. Isn't it the case that when we think about being nonconformist, we really just create a new form of conformity, right? And so my pop culture example here is the Goth kids from South Park, who say if you want to be one of the nonconformists, all you have to do is dress like us and listen to the same music we do. Well, that's just setting up another conformity, right? So it looks like what Foucault is interested in is not setting up just a new version of conformity, but engaging in practices that subvert any kind of conformity, or at least those forms of conformity that are totalizing and normalizing, right? So the idea then seems to be a kind of continual self-transformation. So we don't want to just invert authoritarian relationships, right? We want to try and be creative selves, right? So again, a little South Park example here where one of the Goth kids says, I'm not doing it because being a dance group is totally conformist. And then Michael, one of the Goth kids, says, I'm such a nonconformist that I'm not going to conform with the rest of you, the Goth kids, and go do the dance thing, right? So Falzon, your textbook author, he says, well, what is this implicit principle at work in Foucault's ethics? It's the idea that not whether our society has constraints or not, or whether that's even desirable. Here's the quote from Foucault. It's not whether a culture without constraints is possible or even desirable, but whether the system of constraints in which a society functions leaves individuals the ability to transform the system, and of course themselves along with that system. Are we able, does society permit us to have an active role in shaping our own possibilities for conducting our own lives, right? So Foucault's rejecting a model of power relationships that we talked about earlier in the semester, where it's, freedom from external power. We're never free from power relationships in Foucault because we're never free from social relationships in Foucault. But we can have power relationships or social relationships that are more or less open, right? Such that we can exercise, we have more opportunities to conduct our own lives, right? And others have the same, right? So again, just to recap, for Foucault, ethics is a matter of self-transformation. It's about overcoming docility without setting up a new form of docility. And his project then is developing that genealogy of how we became docile bodies, and then elaborating a notion of critique as an ethics of resistance against it. And so, some of the problems that might arise with Foucault's ethics is, is he once again, excuse me, emphasizing a form of radical individualism? What is the basis for does Foucault's approach to ethics, does it ignore what we owe others, right? I mean, don't I need to be at least docile enough that I'm not violating other people's individuality, right? Or their rights? What do I owe others? So again, we have this issue of what is it that puts a justifiable constraint on how I transform myself with regard to others? And again, there's a worry about whether rejecting any kind of essentialist conception of human nature, that Foucault's undermining the possibility of really giving a coherent guide for ethics there. Again, so we're worried about self-contradiction in there. We've seen that criticism pop up again before, rather, with Nietzsche, right? Doesn't his rejection of universal reason undermine the possibility of really justifying this norm of self-transformation? And then this idea of self-transformation, as freedom of self-transformation, seems kind of vague as well, right? And again, one of these big problems is, oftentimes we think in terms of either ors. We saw Foucault make a comment about that, such that we're, in other words, do the things that present themselves as means of escape from domination really just reinforce a new form of domination to reinforce that system? So you have that problem in Rick and Morty here in the Tales from the Citadel, where the workers are all Ricks. Guy tries to escape that system, but the feeling in his head is made to use simple Rick wafers that are really just a tool of oppression. Right? So a bit of a worry there to concern ourselves with regard to Foucault's ethics. That pretty much does it for the material for this semester. Again, as always, If you have questions about anything we've covered, you can drop me an email. You can also post it in the discussion forum, and we'll have a review session, a live review session at the end of this chapter, and then another review session for the final exam. I hope y'all are all doing well. Take care, and hope to see y'all or talk to y'all soon.